Hello and welcome. Today we are going through The Art of Reasoning textbook, and we're looking at Chapter 5, Fallacies. Now let's sort of refresh as to what we did just prior. We were looking at these 4 previous chapters. In Chapter 1 we learned about pointing out things so that we can actually focus on some particular thing. In Chapter 2 we did definitions, so in other words we sort of formed words. In Chapter 3 we did propositions, putting those words into a sentence. In Chapter 4 we did arguments, which is setting up sentences so that they're related to each other in a particular way. And finally, Chapter 5 is about fallacies, which is improper sentence relations. So at the end of this we should have a pretty decent sense of how things do and don't work. So let's take a look at what we have. Our book defines fallacies as an argument for which the premises appear to support the conclusion but actually provide little or no support. In other words, it's an argument that looks right, but there's something crucially wrong with it, so it doesn't work. And our book sets this up in terms of 4 types of fallacies. There's a lot more, but these are sort of like the core 4 groups. And they have subjectivist fallacies, fallacies of credibility, fallacies of context, and fallacies of logical structure. Now, today we're not going to go through all of these, but I do want to touch on some of the ones that I think are most important. So, let's get started. The first group of fallacies are the subjectivist fallacies. Now, what we mean here by subjectivist is fallacies that are ultimately based on the idea of personal feelings in some way, right? They're not related. The idea is that the claim is not related to truth, capital T truth, but something else, right? Some sort of thing that has a tendency to shift. Let's call it unstable feature. Now the thing with truth is that, quite frankly, truth operates in a mathematical way, right? So 2 and 2 is 4 no matter what. And the sort of trick with truth is something like there is only one way to be right, so this is the only correct answer, but there is an infinite number of ways to be wrong. Why is that? Well, because there is an infinity of numbers, right? So we have infinite numbers, but only one of those numbers is the correct solution to this problem. So when we talk about truth, it's something that's there, it's stable, it's unmoving. And subjectivist fallacies ultimately rely on something that is not stable. They rely on my belief rather than the truth itself. They rely on what the majority of people think, on what I happen to feel, on the sort of scare tactics I can use, things of that nature. So subjectivist fallacies, the book gives us 4, and one is sort of subjectivism. And the idea of subjectivism is something like, because I believe it, it must be true. Right? Let's say, if I believe X, X is true. Now, as soon as you sort of see this, you go like, that doesn't sound quite right, right? People can believe all sorts of rather funny things. Now, in logic, you might not sort of be thinking about the implications of what a statement like this really does. However, if we switch over to, let's say, ethics, all of a sudden a statement like this becomes a very, very massive problem. So I want to show you one of these setups. Now keep in mind that belief is how we know the truth, apparently, according to this fallacy. And so, if you are of college age, and you probably are because you're taking this class, you hear the following statement quite often on campuses, right? Everybody has their own truth. Everybody is free to believe what they want. Everybody is free to have their own ideas of right and wrong, right? We shouldn't push any ideas onto people, so on and so forth. But the way that we think about statements like that tends to be something like, my favorite flavor of ice cream is, let's say, strawberry. That's me. And your favorite flavor of ice cream might happen to be chocolate. Now, I am welcome to prefer strawberry over chocolate, and you are welcome to prefer chocolate over strawberry. And this works for us because these are preferences. And the funny thing is, you can't be wrong about your preference. Right? If you tell me that your favorite flavor of ice cream is chocolate, you can't be wrong about that. You might be lying, but you can't be mistaken. Other than, there's one possible way in which you might be mistaken. You say something like, my favorite flavor of ice cream is chocolate, and I say, okay, can you point to the tub of ice cream that has chocolate, right? Like, show me what do you mean when you say chocolate? And then you point to a tub of ice cream that's actually peanut butter, right? But that's sort of a mistake in expression. That's a word issue, it's a definition issue, not a meaning issue. So, since I can't tell you that you're wrong about liking chocolate, and you can't tell me that I'm wrong about liking strawberry, I also shouldn't be able to force you into liking strawberry, or you shouldn't be able to force me into liking chocolate. Seems pretty straightforward, right? However, what happens if we get to something like, I don't know, sexual assault? And let's see, we'll put Ted Bundy over here as the third person in our group. So I think that sexual assault is bad. That's what I believe. And you believe that sexual assault is bad. And that you believe. But Ted Bundy believes that sexual assault is good. Now, if things that we believe are true, then sexual assault is both good and bad. It's good if you're Ted Bundy because you believe it to be good, and it's bad if you're you or me because we believe that it's bad. So you see, what happened is, normally when we want to make a statement like sexual assault being bad, we like to think that we are referring to something that is outside of ourselves. Right? So there's a standard out here, it is objective, and when I make a statement like this is good or this is bad, what I'm actually saying is this is true or this is false. And so because there is an external standard that I'm referring to, when I say that I believe something, I could be right or I could be wrong. My belief doesn't make it true. But if we have the subjectivism fallacy, what we end up with is belief makes something true. And so when Ted Bundy believes that sexual assault is good, then he would be correct. You can see how immediately we sort of recoil from that sort of position where, like, hey, maybe not that far. But if you take that sort of argument as true, then it has to apply to everything, including Ted Bundy and his sexually deviant proclivities. Alright, so that is subjectivism. For 2, we have the appeal to majority. Oh, and before we go further, I'd like to point this out. I know the book presents these fallacies in a very sort of neat and distinct way, as if they only happen one at a time, but in fact, these fallacies usually happen multiple fallacies at a time. Right? So people then stack their fallacies, and as we'll see, the subjectivist fallacies often go along with fallacies of credibility, in particular ad hominem attacks and fallacies of context, like false alternative. Right? And we'll sort of explore that in a minute, but want to show you this. So the idea here is if because majority of people believe X, then X must be true. Whoops, apparently I can't write. Now again, we have this sort of belief and truth connection, which is a bit of a problem. And again, in ethics, it's really easy to sort of sort out exactly what the problem is here. So you see, since we're here in America, for about 250 years, since like what, 1619 to like 1880s, slavery was entirely legal. At least in terms of the transatlantic trade. It was legal before, but whatever. So the majority of people for that period of time believed that slavery is a good idea, and that it is sort of good in general. And then I would like to hope that nowadays the majority of us believe that slavery is bad. So you see the problem with the majority. Just because majority believe something, one, doesn't mean that they won't change their minds. Two, doesn't make it true. The majority of people believed that astrology is a serious science, and now we don't. The majority of people believe that phrenology, you should look that up, is a serious science, and now we don't. We believe that the atom cannot be divided, and now it can. So you can sort of see what happens here, right? We believe that women shouldn't vote, that women shouldn't be educated. Now, obviously, we believe the opposite. So it's an interesting sort of problem, right? You cannot rely on the majority, because the majority of people can be just as wrong as a minority of people, especially when it comes to complicated issues. Right, up next, and this one is one of the really, really big ones, we have the appeal to emotion. And the idea is, I am going to sort of tear at your heartstrings in order to get you to not really pay attention to the argument, but just to fall for my emotional pleas. And this one is particularly dangerous, a fallacy, when it gets coupled with other things like ad hominem attacks or false alternative attacks. There is man, I can't remember whether it's his quote or if he got it from somebody. So there's an Italian legal thinker called Danilo Zolo. And the line is something like, in an argument, the first person to invoke humanity loses. Because when you start talking about humanity, what you're doing is you're shifting to emotion instead of to reason. Now, you will see these kinds of arguments made all the time. So, for example, we have a person who's getting sentenced for some very serious crime, and the defense lawyer for that person will say something like, oh, you know, we would like to remind the court and the jurors that this person has, you know, 3 small children, and that they will have to grow up without him. And you go like, well, hold on a second, what does the fact that this person has children have to do with the fact that they committed an atrocity? And the answer is effectively nothing, right? But the idea is you're sort of hoping to invoke the implied part of this is it is harmful to children to grow up without a parent, and you don't want these children to suffer because they didn't do anything wrong, so you should be lenient towards the parent who did in fact do something wrong. And it's kind of a nonsensical argument once you break it down like that, but it's something that actually comes up quite often. And let me sort of show you where this plays out most commonly these days. When somebody's offended, when there is outrage, so on and so forth. The fact that somebody is offended says absolutely nothing about the value of the argument. The fact that somebody's outraged says nothing about the value of the argument. In fact, if you make a really good argument for why, let's say if you're a lawyer and you make a really good argument for why Bob the rapist should go to jail forever, Bob is going to be very offended by that argument because you just put him away forever. But that doesn't make it a bad argument. So it's kind of tricky here, right? There are things that are offensive, there are things that are outrageous, but that fact alone is not good enough to disqualify an argument, right? Just because you are shocked and, sort of how dare you, it doesn't mean that the argument's bad. So that is from emotion, and then you have 4, which is our appeal to force. And in this one, we essentially say agree or else. Now, I'd actually like you to think about the way that that law works, right? Law enforcement. With law enforcement, ideally, the way that the laws in your country are set up should be the sort of thing that you can think your way through and go like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. This is why I should actually follow the law. And that'd be nice, except that's not how law enforcement works. So we have, 350, 380 million people in the country, and the idea becomes something like this. We don't have time to make sure that everybody is on board with all the rules. But we do need everybody to act as if they were on board with the rules. And so the idea of law enforcement is precisely this: agree or else. Now that works because law enforcement isn't putting forward an argument, right? The process of creating the law puts forward the argument. The process of enforcing the law is for those people that either don't care that the law is reasonable, or they think they can get away. So it's kind of a fun one. Quite often, in fact, you will see the force argument coupled with the majority argument. Because there is more of us, we are more of a threat to you if you don't agree with us. Alright. So let's burn through a couple of these right quick. The fallacies of credibility, it's really the same fallacy, it just works in 2 different directions. So, when we talk about credibility, what we're doing is we are bringing up the speaker instead of the argument. And we are doing so in a bad way. Now, one way of doing that in a bad way is the appeal to authority, where in essence we say something like, oh, Bob, let's say for example, Bob has a PhD, so he must know what he's talking about. But we should probably ask the question, what exactly does Bob have a PhD in, and is he a reliable source? Right? So if Bob has a degree in I don't know, astrophysics, he's not a competent judge of interpretive dance. Right? He's just not. It's not his area of expertise. And vice versa. So we have this habit of just sort of reaching for an authority that we know and then running with it. Case in point, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is absolutely brilliant as an astrophysicist, held a lecture on religion and science, and he went after sort of a top-level theologian and philosopher by the name of Al-Ghazali. And the idea is something like, well, Neil deGrasse Tyson has a PhD in science, and here he is talking about science, so that must work. When in fact he's not talking about science, he's talking about theology, and he's talking about history, neither of which is his strong suits. And he really botched that lecture. If you want to go ahead and look that up on YouTube, you can both see the lecture, and then you can see a bunch of experts just sort of tearing him a new one. So that's a problem of authority. The other side of the coin is called the ad hominem attack. And the idea behind the ad hominem attack is we're going to bring up the speaker again, not the argument, now in a bad way. Now here we brought up the authority that's not qualified. This is the problem. Here we are going to try to disqualify a person. And if you're actually talking about the argument that they're making or why this person might not know what they're talking about, that would be fine. The point of the ad hominem, though, is to bring up something that is unrelated to the argument. Now, as a philosopher in particular, this is really sort of a bit of a touchy topic for me, because the idea that if you can find that this person did something wrong or said something wrong, that they should therefore be disqualified from participating, would exclude essentially the entirety of the philosophical canon. We couldn't talk about anybody, right? Socrates is pro-pedophilia. Aristotle is in favor of natural slavery, right? So you get these things and you go like, it's probably not a hot idea to worry about the speaker, because ultimately the speaker doesn't matter. This is why bringing up the speaker is generally a bad idea. 2 and 2 is 4, and it doesn't matter who says it, right? The PhD in math says it, and it's true, and it's equally true as if Hitler said it. The argument is the argument. The speaker is ultimately irrelevant. But if we can turn this around and sort of distract you from the argument itself by making you focus on a person who is not actually part of the argument itself, then we can sort of get you to dismiss this person and their argument. Now, the way this couples with something like with the appeal to emotion, you're going to say something along the lines of, oh my God, how could you listen to that person? Look at the terrible things they've done, right? How could you agree with, I don't know, let's find something that's bad. So let's say we have a person that makes some very disparaging remarks about immigrants or some sort of a minority group, something, right? So that's one of their statements. And then later, in an entirely unrelated statement, they make another claim. This one is essentially a math claim. And what you will see for an ad hominem is somebody will come in and they'll essentially say, look, how can you agree with the person who called immigrants this terrible thing, or who said these terrible disparaging remarks about minorities, something like that? And the point is, though, that those two are unrelated, right? One argument for one thing, another argument for another thing. So as philosophers, what we do is we, one, separate the claim from the person, and two, Well, we don't care about other claims. So yes, Aristotle is terribly wrong about natural slavery. I would like to think that's pretty clear to everybody now. But he's not wrong when he talks about the laws of logic. So those are two entirely separate arguments. You treat them entirely separately. You take what's good, you leave what's bad. In the fallacies of context, we see the false alternative argument, which is also known as a false dichotomy. Dichotomy, di meaning two, so a false impression that there's only two options. So again, like is the case for a lot of these fallacies, they have some sort of grounding, but then you take sort of a wrong turn. So there's this trick in logic, and we'll sort of learn it coming up pretty quick. And it's the idea that if I give you two options, right, I tell you A or B is true, right? That means that at least one of these statements is true. Then if I can show you that it's not A, I know that this thing is false, but I know that at least one of these statements is true. Well, if A is false, then B must be true. I don't even have to check it, if the argument is set up properly. So for example, if I say something like, all the students in my logic class did or did not watch this video. So options are did watch, or did not watch. Well, pretty simple, right? There is only two options. In fact, this is the proper way to do it. There is no student in my class who both watched and did not watch the video. The bad version of this is, in essence, when our definition is not, when this split here is not jointly exhaustive, right? We talked about this earlier, I think chapter 1 or chapter 2. So for example, if I say all of the people watching this video are wearing a black shirt, or they're wearing a blue shirt. Is there a way that both of these statements could be false simultaneously? Now, we checked the watching and we found out that no, you can't do that, right? You can't both have watch and not watched, and you also can't have both not watched and not watched. So is it possible that you're not wearing a black shirt and you're not wearing a blue shirt? Yeah, I mean, you could be wearing a pink shirt. You could just not be wearing a shirt. So the problem is that these are not jointly, this is a not jointly exhaustive. We couple this with an ad hominem and an appeal to emotion, and we'll say things like either you, for example, either you support whatever the new ideal policy is regarding, I don't know, let's say abortion. So either you support all abortion, or you think that women should be locked up, and that we should live in a, what's the name of that show? Handmaiden. You think we should live in a handmaiden universe. Now, so hold on a second. There's nothing in between, right? It's an absolute. There's like nobody who is anywhere between those two extremes. So the idea there is, one, we're going to appeal to emotion because we all sort of see the handmaiden universe as a not so hot thing. and then there's an attack on the person before they've ever actually had a chance to put down their position, because we've sort of preemptively called them a sexist, racist, whatever the ist is, and then we've only given them two choices. So it's either agree with me or you're a monster. And then this is both an appeal to emotion and an ad hominem. In fact, you're going to find, oh, and by the way, it's not just agree with me a little bit, it's on everything. So you'll find quite a lot of this in present day way that people talk about politics or about policy or about rights of various varieties or things of that nature. You can see this play out for those of you who have seen Game of Thrones. It's the next to last episode. I guess spoiler alert, if you don't want to hear what happens, cover your ears now. Daenerys' little speech to Jon Snow about how she knows what's right, and anybody who disagrees with her needs to be put down like an animal. That's this fallacy, right? And in fact, it's loaded exactly this way, right? It's an emotional appeal and an ad hominem attack simultaneously on the other side, along with being a false dichotomy. Let's see. Let's just cover two more here from logical structure. Equivocation is always a fun one that goes wrong. When we use the same words and phrases that are supposed to mean one thing, but we use a different definition of them when it's our turn to speak. And this is just flat out lying. What I mean by that is you are intentionally twisting the words so the other person will agree with you, when you know that if you told them what you actually think, there is no chance that they would actually agree with you. So, for example, here let's use a U.S. military example. Enemy combatant. If you're the sort of person that follows these things, you might have noticed that starting in about 2011, we started accidentally killing a whole lot less civilians with our drone strikes, and we started killing a lot more enemy combatants. And that sounds like a wonderful thing, right? A lot less people who shouldn't be getting killed get killed, and a lot more people who apparently should get killed are getting killed, right? Seems like a pretty straight thing. Now, normally what we mean by enemy combatant has to be a member of enemy armed forces. Or, even if we don't know that the person is an enemy, is a member of enemy armed forces, if they are a current direct threat, right, then we can still consider them an enemy combatant. Now, this is a definition that's sort of been used since, well, forever, right? Well, in 2011, because we kept killing so many civilians, we said, well, you know, let's we got to make this look a little better. And so what we did is we changed the definition. The U.S. government Pentagon definition is now any male ages 15 to 65. That's it. That's a new definition. So if there was a bunch of 15-year-olds playing soccer and we accidentally hit them with a Hellfire missile, we did not kill any civilians. we killed enemy combatants, because that is now the new definition. So when you change the definition of an enemy combatant, you also change inherently the definition of a civilian. So if you were reading reports from, let's say, 2010 to 2012 on drone strikes and how many civilians died as opposed to how many enemy combatants died, you would notice something like a pretty steep drop in civilian deaths right around 2011. The thing is, unless you dug into the various publications by Pentagon, you wouldn't realize that this had happened in 2011. And so you would come away with the false idea that we are somehow killing less people who are civilians. And that's because we kept using the exact same phrases, but we changed the meaning so that people would get the other idea. All right. The final one I want to touch on real quick is the appeal to ignorance. And that's the idea that if I have no proof that X is not true, then X is true. And this one, you would be surprised just how often something like this comes up. And not just in terms of like, oh, okay, you know, we weren't really paying attention or something like that. It's more in terms of, again, I think I'm just going to use ethical examples because they're kind of simple. If somebody comes forward and they make a claim, let's see here. Actually, so imagine, well, we'll talk about this coupled with ad hominem. We say, okay, so we don't have any proof that we have Bob, and let's say Bob is accused of being, whatever, a thief. That's the accusation. And it's your accusation, right? You came up with it. Well, do we have any proof that Bob is not a thief? Well, no. Oh, so Bob must be a thief. Hold up. You see this used like after 9/11, and then more recently a couple of years ago with people like Sam Harris and whatnot regarding things like Islamic terrorism. They'll say something like, many Muslims support terrorism. And you go like, well, where'd you get that from? Right? Like, where's your proof of that? And they go like, well, there's no proof that they don't support terrorism, so they must support terrorism. See the problem? Right? Like, you just implied something about 1.8 billion people on the planet for no apparent reason. Now, we like to couple this, again, with the ad hominem and with the emotion, with the appeal to emotion. And what this will do is, if you think of any number of court cases that come up, right? Something terrible happened, the person has been terribly wronged, or at least they say that they have been, right? So you have some sort of a crime that happened, and it needs to be like a bad one. And so right there we have the emotional part kicks in. And then we say something like, anybody who does not convict the person that we have currently arrested is the same as the criminal. So, And then you'll notice that there's also now the appeal to force here. Now, here's the thing. We have no idea whether Bob is guilty or not. We don't know anything about the case. You might have read some stuff on the news or whatever, but you haven't actually seen any of the evidence. Because of course you haven't, right? Because evidence is what's going to be presented in the court to the judge and the jury. And we have a procedural standard for something like that. This is also then going to pull up a dichotomy. And people will say something like, well, it must have been Bob. And you go like, well, why did it have to be Bob, right? Like, how do you know Bob is guilty? And they go like, well, I don't know that he's innocent. Now, they might not say it in exactly those words, but they might say something like, well, you know, where was Bob at the time of the murder? Like, well, did you take a statement? Like, what's going on? Like, why would you have privileged information about the case? And the answer is you wouldn't. So, in essence, the appeal to ignorance is the exact opposite of our constitutional idea of innocent until proven guilty. And I don't particularly care what your stance on various what do you call it? On various Supreme Court justices is, but if you look at the Kavanaugh hearings, I can't spell his name, it's a mess. What really caught my attention, and again, this is from an ethics perspective, when they were going to have their hearing, so that they called in the woman that had made the accusation, and they called in Brett Kavanaugh, and now there's going to be this back and forth. Before any questions are asked, before any statements are made, before anything, right, the various committee members get to make statements. And you would think that statements would be something like, hey, you know, this is a really important hearing, because these sorts of accusations should not be taken lightly. We should really dig into this because the character of the Supreme Court justice should matter quite a lot, and blah, blah, blah. And that would be fine, right? Because what you're doing is you're not passing judgment, right? You don't have this, like, convict Bob or else mentality. But what we actually saw was a bunch of people, a bunch of senators. One side got up and said something along the lines of, this person is a hero because we believe what they have said. And you're like, well, hold on, they didn't say anything yet. You haven't asked any questions. In other words, you convicted what do you call it? You convicted the would-be Supreme Court nominee before hearing evidence. What exactly is going on? On the other hand, a bunch of senators and congressmen, I guess in general, from the other side, got up and said things like, justice, or not justice, he would become a justice, Kavanaugh must be innocent. You're like, well, you don't know that either, right? So one side says something like, we don't know that he's innocent, so he must be guilty. And the other side says something like, well, we don't know that he's guilty, so he must be innocent. And the whole point of this thing right here is that you're supposed to suspend judgment until you see the proof part. And then you have something to make a judgment about. Now notice why this fallacy is a fallacy. It's because both sides could use it equally well. I don't know that this person committed this crime, so they must not have committed a crime. Or, I don't know that this person did not commit the crime, so they must not have committed a crime. Did I just screw that up? Yeah, I don't know that they're not guilty, so they must be guilty. I don't know that they are guilty, so they must be innocent. Okay, so there you go. That's the math on that. And again, I don't particularly care for any of these people, but you can sort of see where the logical fallacy is built into the way that we communicate. And you can see, by the way, that that's built up on this emotional appeal, because believing the victim is a sort of an emotional pitch. You can notice that there's a sort of force that's there, right? Or else you must be a supporter of this sort of criminal behavior. There's a dichotomy because there's an or else. And of course there's an ad hominem that's being made specifically regarding the crime. So, and you as the listener, right, as to whether or not you're going to agree or not, because if you don't agree with this person, you also must be guilty. So that's a couple of these fallacies. There's a lot more of them. There's literally dozens of fallacies that you can go study. The reason why we actually bother spelling out all of these fallacies is the same reason why your doctor can't just tell you that you're sick and leave it at that. Right? Depending on your sickness, you need a different kind of treatment. So the sales pitch then is something like this. In order to be able to adequately treat the problem, you have to very specifically identify the problem. So that's why we have all these different types of fallacies. That's why they're named, so that you can pinpoint exactly what went wrong, so that you can then attempt to fix it. Obviously, if you find a fallacy, you have one of two options. One is you can sort of throw out the entire argument. I wouldn't suggest that. That's a cool debate tactic, but that's about it. Instead, if you run into a fallacy, what you should attempt to do is you should identify what the fallacy is, and then see if you can fix the argument. Because if you can, then you still end up with a good argument, right? And that's something that's valuable in and of itself. But if you can't fix it, then you're going to need a different sort of a setup altogether. Alright, so that covers the first 5 chapters of our logic textbook. After this, we're moving to the OLI system from Carnegie Mellon University. If you have questions, comments, concerns, anything else, feel free to leave it in the comments or shoot me an email, and I'll see you all.